Hey everybody, Don with Brazier Toneworks here, and today we're going to be talking about wiring up a Les Paul. I'm going to be going over the two most common methods, the vintage or 50s style, as well as the modern style. Now there are a lot of things written about these two types of wiring schemes out on the internet, and I would encourage you to go out there and take a look at them if you're really interested. But the main difference is, when you wire a guitar using the modern method, the effect on the tone control is that it's happening before the volume control. Whereas with a vintage or 50s wired guitar, the tone control is actually happening after the volume control. So when you have your tone knob set all the way to the 10 position, you're not going to hear any difference between these. It's just when you start to turn that in conjunction with the volume is when you're going to be able to tell the difference between these two types of wirings. So if you think about it, with the modern style, as you would turn your volume knob down, your tone knob is actually going to act as an additional capacitor, and it's going to reduce some of the treble coming out of the pickups. Whereas on a vintage, that tone is actually, the tone knob is behind or after the volume, so as you turn down the volume, you're not going to have such a bleed off of your treble. So if you're trying to figure out which style to go with, it comes down to this. If you like your Les Pauls a little bit brighter, go vintage. If you're not using your volume control now because when you use it, treble gets kind of lost, go vintage. But again, it's personal preference. The modern sound might be perfect for you, but this is just giving you a couple options on setting it up. Okay, looking at this diagram, you can see this is a standard layout for the components. You should have your pickups, your switch, your jack, and four 500K pots already put in the guitar. Some people build this outside of the guitar. I tend to do it inside. It's personal preference. During this demonstration, I'm going to refer to the lugs, or the parts that you're going to be soldering on, as lugs 1, 2, and 3. 2 is the middle. It's fairly obvious. 1 is the very top one on the volumes, and 1 is the very bottom one on the tones. Obviously, the pots are turned around here, but I'm going to refer to these lugs as 1, 2, and 3 for the purpose of this. So this is your standard layout. First thing we deal with is the grounding. We ground one wire to the bridge. We ground one wire to each of the pots like I have here. Take one of the last pots and wire that to your jack as kind of the negative output on that. We also, on the volume, two volume pots, we need to ground lug number 1 to the top of the pot. A variety of different ways you can ground these. Some people bend them. I tend to use guitar strings or some other wire and just wire them through. That way I can reuse the pot later on without bending it back and forth. Again, it's personal preference. Once we have the grounding in place, now we can start to wire the actual pickups. Doesn't matter if we're talking a neck pickup or a bridge pickup, it's the exact same thing. The ground is obviously going to go to the ground of that particular pot. The hot or the lead is going to go to lug number 3. You can see that here. Again, doesn't matter, bridge and neck, they're exactly wired the same way. From here, we move on to the switch. Now, getting the wiring through your guitar is going to be a little tricky. You might end up using thinner wire, depending on what you have. This is the trickiest part. You basically are going to have 4 wires coming through from the switch. You're going to have the ground. You can run that to whichever of the 2 pots you want to. In this particular example, I went to the neck pot. You are also going to have the returning switch wire from the neck and the bridge. You can see those are wired to the center or lug number 2 of the corresponding volume pots. Then we have the total output from the switch, and that goes to the positive point on the jack. At this point, you have what's known as the standard component wiring. This is how your Les Paul should look without regard to whether or not you're going to wire it in a vintage or a modern style. This is the way the inside of your guitar should look at this point. To do a 50s or vintage wiring, the first thing we need to do is ground the tone pots. You can see here what I've done is I've had to ground the middle lug of both tone pots. Put that in, grind it to the top, and we're set to go. We can actually now move on to the capacitor. A vintage or 50s wired capacitor goes from the center lug of the volume to lug number 1 of the tone pots. So you can see that. Again, it doesn't matter if we're talking the bridge or the neck. They're both wired the exact same way. Lug number 2 or the middle lug for the volume, the bottom one or lug number 1 for the tone. At this point, you're done. You have a vintage or 50s style wired Les Paul. Close up, play, and go nuts, and you're all set. If you want to do the modern, it's a little bit different. We have to take a couple steps back, and we have to reground the tone pots. In a modern wiring, we are grounding lug number 1, just like we did on the volume pots. We're going to make the tone pots look exactly the same. We're going to ground the first lug to the top of the pot itself. From here, we put the capacitors in. In this style, we ground from lug number 3 on the volume to the middle lug of the tone pots. So it's almost backwards from the vintage. And again, I explained earlier what this does in relation to the tone and sound of the guitar. But at this point, once you've got the capacitors in there, you have now a modern wired Les Paul. If you went out and you bought one today, 99% of them are going to be wired this way, just the way they do it. You have the opportunity. You can simply take the wiring that's in there, redo it according to this, and turn it back into a vintage or 50s wired Les Paul if that's what you want to do. So there you go. 2 simple ways to wire up a Les Paul or SG. Each will give you a slightly different tone depending on what you're looking for. It's an easy mod. Try it. You don't like it, go back to the way you had it. Definitely something that's easy. It's not going to take you a long time to do, and hopefully it's going to improve your tone. So again, appreciate you watching. Hopefully you get a chance to watch some of my other videos. And as always, just remember, tone. It's not just a knob.